The first time that woman drove across my ranch, I figured she was lost. The 10th time, I knew she was making a point. By the time she smiled into my trail camera and blew me a kiss, I understood this was never about saving a few minutes on her commute. It was about proving she believed my land belonged to anyone bold enough to take it. My name is Travis Hale. I was 57 then, retired from the Marines, and I owned 840 acres outside Red Willow, Wyoming, a hard stretch of country with wind-bent cottonwoods, shale ridges, and enough open sky to make a man feel small in the best possible way. I had spent 23 years building that place into something steady. My wife, Nora, used to joke that I trusted fence posts more than people because fence posts at least stayed where you put them. She was not entirely wrong. That ranch had seen blizzards, busted wells, and a horse with a gift for kicking only expensive things. But none of it tested my patience like the residents of Briar Glen after their polished subdivision went up along my southern boundary. Briar Glen was all stone mailboxes, matching roofs, and people who complained when the wind carried the smell of cattle their way. Most kept to themselves. But then came Vanessa Creel. Vanessa was vice president of the Homeowners Association, though she carried herself like governor of the county. She drove a pearl-white Range Rover, wore giant black sunglasses, and had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. The first morning I saw her, I was on the back porch drinking coffee, watching frost lift off the alfalfa field, when that Range Rover came over the southern rise and dropped onto an old maintenance track through my pasture. It was not a road, just two worn tire lines the electric company used once or twice a year. She came through fast, through gravel, cut across the field, and vanished near the county highway. I figured she had missed a turn. Then she did it again the next morning, and the one after that, always around 7:25, always moving like she had every right in the world. By the end of the week, I walked down to the cattle guard and waited, right on schedule. The Range Rover rolled up and the window came down. She looked at me over her sunglasses. "Are you having some kind of problem?" she asked, like I was blocking her driveway. I said, "Ma'am, this is private property. There are signs posted at both ends." She glanced at one of the old metal signs and smiled. "Those are practically rusted blank," she said. "Besides, everyone knows this trail connects to Route 9. It saves me almost 4 minutes." I told her 4 minutes did not create a right-of-way. She laughed and tapped one red fingernail against the steering wheel. "Well, maybe not officially," she said. "The people have been using it." That was not true, and we both knew it. Before I could answer, she raised the window, rolled past me slowly, then accelerated once she hit the grass. She was not confused. She was showing me my warning did not matter. That night, Nora listened while I told the story over meatloaf and green beans. She had worked as a court reporter for nearly 30 years and knew how ugly small acts of entitlement could become. "Do not yell at her," she said. "Do not touch her vehicle. Do not block her in. And do not give that woman a sentence she can twist against you." Then she pointed her fork at me. "But document everything, Travis, because people like that count on decent folks getting tired first." The next morning, I replaced every old sign with bright orange ones that read "Private Property. No vehicle access. Violators will be reported." I added reflective strips and mounted 2 cellular trail cameras where they could capture plates and faces. There was no way anyone could miss the message. Vanessa came through at 7:27. The footage showed her slowing down, reading the sign, then turning toward the camera. She smiled, gave a little beauty queen wave, and drove on. I watched that clip 3 times while Nora stood behind me with her arms folded. "She is baiting you," she said. "I know," I told her. What I did not know was how many people she had already convinced that my ranch was some kind of shortcut. Within 5 days, 3 more vehicles followed her path. By the second week, I had 7 different plates logged on camera. They tore deep ruts into the field, crushed young grass, and spooked my mares every morning. One driver tossed a coffee cup out the window. Another stopped near the creek so a dog could run loose among my cattle. I drove to the Briar Glen office and asked to speak with the board, but the receptionist barely looked up. "You are not a resident," she said, "so the board is not obligated to meet with you." I left copies of my survey and a written warning anyway. 3 days later, I received a thick envelope from the HOA attorney. It claimed I was interfering with a long-established neighborhood access route and warned that any barrier I placed could expose me to liability. I read it twice, then once more to make sure arrogance had not started writing legal correspondence by itself. Nora read it and went still. "They are building a story," she said. "They want to turn trespassing into tradition." That afternoon, I found my southern gate lying flat in the mud, both hinges ripped out, fresh chain marks carved into the post. Near the broken latch was a small red acrylic fingernail, cracked down the middle. I picked it up and felt something inside me go quiet, not calm exactly, more like the silence before a storm makes up its mind. Vanessa thought she was teaching me who had power. What she had actually done was give me the first piece of physical evidence in a fight she still believed was only a game. I slipped that broken fingernail into a plastic evidence bag Nora kept from an old courthouse supply box, labeled it with the date and time, then photographed the gate from every angle before I touched the thing. That part mattered more than most people realize. Anger tells you to fix the damage. Evidence tells you to leave it exactly as you found it until the camera has seen everything. I called Deputy Cole Mercer from the county office, a square-shouldered man with a slow drawl and the permanently tired expression of someone who had spent too many years separating neighbors over fences and barking dogs. He came out, looked at the chain marks, watched the trail camera footage, and rubbed one hand over his jaw. "You know who did it," he said. "I know who I suspect," I answered. "Different thing." He nodded, and I could tell he appreciated that. Cole had seen enough people ruin good cases by saying too much too early. He wrote the report, photographed the gate, took a copy of the footage, and told me the same thing Nora had been telling me. "Keep documenting. Do not confront anyone alone." The problem was that Vanessa did not slow down after the report. She got bolder. It was as if the broken gate had become a ceremonial ribbon cutting for a road only she had the authority to declare open. The traffic doubled within 2 weeks. A black Lexus came through every morning behind her, followed by a red Jeep, a silver Audi, and one oversized pickup with a Briar Glen Golf Club sticker in the window. They did not even stay on the maintenance track anymore. Whenever the ground got soft, they swung wider into the grass, carving new lines through the pasture like kids dragging sticks through wet paint. I started waking before dawn just to check the cameras, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The ranch had always been the place where I slept deeply. After the Marines, I spent years learning how to stop waking at every sound, how to let a slammed door be a slammed door instead of something incoming. Now I was back to watching the dark, listening for engines, feeling my shoulders tighten whenever headlights crossed the southern ridge. Nora saw it before I did. One night she found me standing at the kitchen window in my socks, staring toward the pasture with a cold cup of coffee in my hand. "Travis," she said softly, "they're already taking more than grass from you." That landed hard. I had spent so much time measuring damage in ruts, fences, and lost hay that I had not noticed what the whole thing was doing inside my own house. I was distracted at dinner, short with the hired hands, and impatient with a young gelding that had done nothing wrong except shy at the sound of an engine. I apologized to Nora and to the horse. Though the horse seemed less impressed, then I made a decision. I would stop reacting to Vanessa one incident at a time. I would build one complete case that showed the pattern, the motive, the damage, and the lies. Nora turned the dining room table into what she called the world's ugliest command center. Reprinted camera stills, marked vehicle routes on aerial maps, saved the HOA letters, logged every plate, every timestamp, every broken post, every discarded cup, every foot or damaged field. My neighbor to the west, a retired surveyor named Calvin Rowe, came over one evening with a tube full of old plaques and a bottle of bourbon he claimed was for professional accuracy. Calvin was 71, thin as a fence rail, and had the peculiar habit of whispering whenever he said something important. He spread the old maps across the table, adjusted his glasses, and traced the southern boundary with one tobacco-stained finger. "There's never been a public easement here," he said quietly. "Not recorded, not implied, not anything. That maintenance tract belongs entirely to your parcel. The power company has a limited service license, but nobody else has access." Nora leaned closer. "Could the HOA claim a prescriptive easement?" Calvin gave a dry laugh. "Not unless they've somehow been driving through Travis land openly for 10 years without objection, which would be impressive considering their subdivision is 4 years old." That was the first moment I felt the balance shift. Just a little. Vanessa had been acting like confidence could manufacture history. The record said otherwise. I hired Calvin and his younger partner to conduct a new certified survey. They placed fresh pins, photographed each marker, and produced a detailed boundary report showing that the Briar Glen property line ended 78 feet before the path Vanessa had been using. Every one of those vehicles was not skimming a disputed edge. They were driving deep inside my ranch. I sent the survey, the incident report, and a formal notice to the entire HOA board by certified mail. I kept the language simple. Access was revoked. No permission had ever been granted, and further entry would be treated as deliberate trespass. Vanessa responded in less than a day. Her email was 3 paragraphs of polished contempt. She claimed the neighborhood had relied on the route in good faith, accused me of hostility toward local families, and warned that closing the trail could delay emergency services. That last part was almost clever. Almost. I called the county fire chief, the ambulance district, and the sheriff office. None of them listed my maintenance trail as an emergency route. The official emergency access for Briar Glen was a paved road on the opposite side of the development. Vanessa was not protecting ambulances. She was protecting her morning commute. Still, she knew how to turn convenience into virtue and defiance into public service. A week later, she brought 2 HOA board members to my front gate. I saw them from the barn and walked over with my phone recording in my shirt pocket. Vanessa wore a cream-colored coat and high-heeled boots that sank into the mud every time she shifted her weight. The other 2 looked uncomfortable before the conversation even started. "Travis," she said, using my first name like we were old friends. "We need to resolve this before it becomes unpleasant." I looked at the flattened gate behind her. "Seems like we passed unpleasant a while back." Her smile tightened. "Nobody can prove who damaged that gate." "True," I said, "but somebody left part of herself behind." Her eyes dropped for half a second toward her red nails. One was shorter than the others. That tiny reaction told me more than an hour of arguing would have. She recovered quickly. "We are prepared to offer you a monthly maintenance payment for continued use," she said. It was not an apology, and it was not a request. It sounded like she was announcing terms to an employee. I asked how much. She named a number so low I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes your body refuses to let an insult enter quietly. "You destroy the gate, tore up grazing land, frightened livestock, and sent me legal threats," I said, "and now you want to rent a road that does not exist for less than I pay to shoe 1 horse." One of the board members, a nervous man named Paul Danner, looked away. Vanessa did not. Her voice dropped. "You need to think carefully," she said. "Briar Glen has resources. I spent 20 years around people who use quiet voices when they wanted a threat to sound reasonable. I knew the style." I stepped closer, not enough to intimidate, just enough that she had to look directly at me. "So do I," I said. "Mine are called patience, property records, and video." She stared at me for a long second, then turned on one heel and walked back to her SUV, leaving deep little holes in the mud. I thought the meeting might have scared off the board. Instead, it triggered something worse. 3 nights later, at 2:17 in the morning, one of my cameras caught a young man in a lifted truck doing circles near the irrigation line. He tore through a section of newly seeded ground, clipped a valve box, and set water spraying across the pasture. When I hit him with the spotlight from my utility vehicle, he leaned out the window and shouted something about free roads before racing back toward Briar Glen. The plate belonged to Vanessa's nephew, Eric Creel. Cole Mercer cited him for property damage, but Vanessa paid the fine and called it youthful confusion. Youthful confusion cost me $1,000 in repairs and 2 days of labor. I stopped feeling insulted after that. Insult was too small a word. This had become an organized campaign to make resistance more expensive than surrender. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was checking mineral blocks near the lower field when I heard 2 engines revving hard from the south. The sound was wrong, too fast, too playful, the sound of people using a living place as a private racetrack. I climbed the ridge and saw Vanessa Range Rover running side by side with a blue Porsche driven by a younger woman I later learned was her daughter, Celeste. They were laughing, pushing each other for position, throwing mud over the grass. My cattle scattered ahead of them. One small black calf broke from the herd and ran across the track. Vanessa had time to brake. The camera proved that later. Instead, she swerved just enough to avoid a direct hit, clipped the calf with the right front corner, then kept going. I reached him a minute later. He was alive, trembling so hard his whole body shook. One hind leg folded beneath him at an angle that made my stomach turn. I knelt in the mud and put one hand against his neck, talking low even though I was not sure whether I was calming him or myself. From the ridge, I could still hear those engines fading toward the highway. I had known rage before. Hot rage, frightened rage. The kind that burns through judgment. This was different. This was cold, clear, and almost peaceful. I carried that calf as far as I could, then called my ranch hand, Miguel Santos, to bring the trailer. The veterinarian said the leg was badly sprained but not broken. He would recover, though it would take time. Back at the house, Nora and I watched the footage frame by frame. Vanessa's face was visible through the windshield. After the impact, she looked into the mirror, looked toward the calf, and kept driving. On the audio, faint but clear, she told Celeste, "Do not stop." Nora closed the laptop and sat very still. That was the moment she stopped treating this as a property dispute. "Call Cole," she said. "Then call an attorney." I called both. Cole came out, saw the calf, watched the video, and for once, he did not look tired. He looked angry. "This gives me reckless driving and leaving the scene of property damage," he said, maybe more depending on the county prosecutor. "But be ready. Their lawyers will say the animal entered an established roadway." I looked at the torn pasture, the wrecked irrigation line, the broken gate, and the hoofprints pressed between tire ruts. Then I looked south toward Briar Glen and felt something settle into place. "There's no established roadway," I said, "and by the time I am finished, there will not even be a place for her tires to fit." That night, Nora and I spread every document we had across the dining room table. The survey, the camera logs, the veterinary report, the HOA letters, Cole incident notes, photographs of the broken gate, and the certified boundary map Calvin had signed in blue ink. Nora moved through the stack with the calm precision of someone who had spent half her life listening to lawyers turn simple facts into fog. "We are not giving them another argument," she said. "We are giving them a boundary they cannot pretend not to see." The next morning, I drove into Red Willow and stopped at an industrial supply yard on the edge of town, the kind of place that sells things designed to survive forklifts, snow plows, and human stupidity. I ordered 8 steel security posts, 6 inches thick, 4 feet tall, reinforced through the center, and painted a bright yellow that could probably be seen from low orbit. The salesman asked what I was protecting. I told him, mostly my patients. He laughed until he realized I was serious. Before I installed anything, I filed a site plan with the county, attached a certified survey, confirmed the setback requirements, and got written approval from the road department that the post would not obstruct any public route or emergency access. I sent copies to Cole, the fire chief, my attorney, and the HOA board. Vanessa responded with a cease and desist letter before the truck carrying the post even reached my ranch. She called the project malicious, dangerous, and discriminatory toward Briar Glen residents. My attorney, Grant Holloway, replied with one sentence: "Private landowners are not required to provide shortcuts to people who dislike their commute." I framed that letter in the workshop. For 3 days, Miguel and I worked at the southern boundary with an auger, a level, rebar, and more bags of high-strength concrete than my back cared to remember. We dug each hole deep, set the posts in a straight line, and spaced them wide enough for a rider, a ranch cart, or emergency personnel on foot, but far too narrow for a vehicle. I bolted reflective signs across the center posts: private property, no motor vehicle access, criminal trespass recorded by camera. Under that, in smaller print, I listed the county statute number and the sheriff office phone. It was not hidden, camouflaged, or designed to surprise anybody. It was a legal barrier with the visual subtlety of 8 yellow exclamation points. Vanessa watched the installation from the ridge through binoculars. On the final afternoon, she parked her Range Rover near the Briar Glen side and marched down in white boots that were completely wrong for mud. "You cannot do this," she shouted before she was even close. I wiped concrete from my gloves and said, "The county thinks I can. This is a recognized community route." "No, it is a damaged pasture with excellent marketing." Her face tightened. "People depend on this access. You depend on it, Vanessa, because 4 minutes feels more valuable to you than somebody else's property." She stepped toward me and lowered her voice. "Take them out, Travis, or I will make sure this ranch becomes impossible for you to keep." There it was. No more talk about ambulances or families, just a threat underneath all of it. She did not want a road. She wanted obedience. I looked at her and felt surprisingly little anger. You have been trying to make me smaller for months, I said, and all you have done is make the line clearer. She stared at me, then turned away so hard one heel slid sideways in the mud. For 3 nights, the ranch was quiet. The camera showed cars reaching the ridge, stopping in front of the posts, and slowly backing out. No engines across the pasture, no headlights cutting through the bedroom, no tire noise near the cattle. I slept 6 straight hours the second night, which felt like a vacation. On the 4th morning, my phone chimed at 7:23. Motion alert, south boundary. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when I opened the live feed. Vanessa Range Rover appeared at the top of the track, moving much faster than usual. She did not hesitate when the posts came into view. She accelerated. I still do not know what she believed in that moment. Maybe she thought they were hollow. Maybe she thought the concrete was decorative. Maybe she had spent so many years watching people step aside that she honestly believed steel would do the same. The camera captured everything. The engine rising, the hood dipping over the ruts, her hands locked on the wheel, and the complete absence of brake lights. She lined up with the center post and drove straight at it. The impact sounded like a metal building collapsing inside a thunderstorm. The Range Rover stopped so violently the back end lifted, twisted, and slammed down sideways. The hood folded into a deep V. Steam burst through the grille, and both airbags filled the cabin. The post did not move, not an inch. By the time I reached the field, Vanessa was climbing out through the driver door, pale, limping, one side of her coat stained with mud and radiator fluid. She looked at the wreck, then at the yellow post standing through what used to be the front of her vehicle. "You trapped me," she screamed. "I will own this ranch when I am finished with you." I held up my phone. "You drove into a stationary object on private property while being recorded from 3 angles. That is a difficult trap to explain." Cole arrived 10 minutes later, followed by an ambulance and a tow truck. He checked Vanessa, walked the boundary pins, studied the warning signs, and watched the footage on my phone. Then he turned to her. "Mrs. Creel, you are being cited for criminal trespass and reckless driving, and the prosecutor still wants to discuss the livestock incident." She started shouting about the HOA, emergency access, and attempted murder. Cole looked at the crushed Range Rover, then at the untouched reflective sign. "Ma'am," he said, "a man cannot attempt to murder you by owning a fence." The lawsuits came anyway. Briar Glenn hired a city firm to claim prescriptive access, unsafe obstruction, negligence, emotional distress, and just about every other phrase that sounds expensive when printed on thick paper. Grant dismantled them one by one. The subdivision was too new to establish an easement. Every use had been openly opposed. The barriers were permitted, reflective, documented, and entirely inside my surveyed boundary. Then came the videos. Vanessa waving at the cameras, residents leaving trash, Eric destroying the irrigation line, the broken gate, the injured calf, the words, "Do not stop," and finally the Range Rover accelerating into the posts. The judge watched in silence. When the lights came back on, he looked over his glasses at Vanessa and said, "Persistent arrogance does not mature into a property right." He granted a permanent injunction, awarded damages for the pasture, the gate, the irrigation equipment, the calf treatment, and legal fees, then warned the HOA board that any further attempt to manufacture an access claim could trigger a review of its records and conduct. Vanessa resigned. 11 days later, the convoy disappeared overnight. By spring, fresh clover had begun filling the ruts. The calf was running without a limp, and the ranch sounded like itself again. A Briar Glen resident named Daniel Pike stopped at my main gate one afternoon and handed me a thermos. "Most of us never wanted that shortcut," he said. "We were just too afraid to challenge her." I thanked him, and we stood there for a while watching the horses move through the lower field. The yellow posts are still there, scratched and dented, especially the center one. And every morning I see that scar where her bumper met a boundary she could not intimidate. Sometimes I wonder whether I went too far, whether steel and concrete were too final. But then I remember the calf in the ditch, Nora watching headlights through our kitchen window, and Vanessa telling me my own land would become impossible to keep. Peace is not the absence of conflict. I learned that years ago. Peace is what remains when a line is clear enough that nobody gets to pretend it is not there. So, tell me what you think. Did I protect my ranch the right way? Or did those steel posts turn a property dispute into something more dangerous than it needed to be? And if someone kept crossing your boundary after every warning, how far would you go to make them stop? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this with somebody who has fought an HOA or a neighbor who thought rules were for other people. And subscribe, because out here the quietest fights usually leave the deepest tracks.